All right, well, welcome back to another episode of Unlearn with us. Today I have Marilyn McMillan joining us. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you.
So Marilyn and I met, I was just trying to figure that out, probably about 10, 15 years ago.
Well,
maybe not that many, 10 years.
No, at least I think 12, because this will be my 12th or 13 year teaching.
Yes. So we met at Woodruff High School, where I had been teaching, and Marilyn came in and was doing LTOs, and we got to know one another, and we were teaching similar courses, I think.
Social studies, and I was also doing Spec Ed, yeah.
Right. Then I think I went on mat leave. Anyways, we've been through some weddings and some babies and lots of crazy stuff. But we've also realized that we share a very similar teaching philosophy. And Marilyn is doing really great things in our public system to try and change things up. So we're going to hear a little bit about that and talk about education and where we need it to be going. So Marilyn, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay, so Rebecca already covered. My name's Marilyn. I think too, what I'll start with is, I'm just looking through my notes. So, I was raised mostly in Ottawa, but I came here in grade 3. And for me, the education system was really different here because there was French in the system. And in the West Coast, they didn't have French. I'll go through sort of some of, I think, starting with, some of my major accomplishments. For me, my educational success is a major accomplishment for me. And that might seem kind of strange for some people, but for me, I have an LD. And I was the first in my family to go to post-secondary. So, a big deal. And when my dad was very dyslexic and didn't read or write, so we were told growing up, that we were going to have an education. And that did happen for me. And, the path wasn't always easy along the way, but so that's one major success for me. But another one is my family. Really, having a solid, we're a little family structure. I have a daughter and my husband, but it's really what grounds me and keeps me going. I've been teaching for, I think I'm going into my 13th year, 12th or 13th year. I went to Trent University as a concurrent education student. So right out of high school. And I think that's 17 years ago, which is crazy to think. And in concurrent ed, you do kind of placements every year. And that was really a really good journey for me. I was in Peterborough, which is very different because Ottawa is a very, very different city than Peterborough. The demographics are very different. And so all of a sudden, I think my first high school that I was in, I think there were 3 Asian students out of 1,200 kids. And that was really shocking to me because I went to Laurentian High School, which is now closed, but very different demographics. And so I did all of my placements there, except for my final one at Queen's. So it was Trent Queen's concurrent, where I did it in Brighton. Also very different from what I was used to. And then I came back here with my boyfriend, who's now my husband, and I started as a supply teacher, and I ended up at Woodruff, which is where I met you, and I did LTOs there for quite a few years, 3 or 4 years. And then from there I worked at the board for a year doing the assistive technology teacher. And that was a really important role for me because I got to work with staff and students with assistive technology, because I use it myself, like all the time. I use it to read. So I use Kurzweil. I used Kurzweil. Now I use Google Read and Write because it's grown, it's developed quite a bit. But that was a significant thing for me in my career to do. And then from there, I've taught ELD, I've taught mostly Spec Ed, ESL, a lot of social studies, and then I landed myself at Hillcrest. This will be my I'm going into my 7th year at Hillcrest, teaching in the secondary credit support ASD program. And I'm leaving there. This is my final year. Sort of bittersweet given that we were teaching virtually, but I absolutely loved teaching in the ASD program because these kids really taught me a lot about the classroom after I had gone back and taught history while I was still working in the program. It really opened my eyes to a lot of the challenges that they have and some of the practices that I had, right, in my own classroom and how that affected them. And some of these kids I taught for 2 periods. So I taught them history and I taught them learning strategies. And that year was a really eye-opening year for me in terms of my own practice and my own growth. And then, I think when you went on mat leave that year, I had your
History
your
class?
classes. Families and ancient history. And I think that was really a turning point for me too, because it was mostly project based, right? And I learned a lot from that, and it was working. When I went back into the history classroom after teaching in ASD, I had a lot of resources, but things weren't feeling, I don't know how to say it, like I wasn't excited by my resources anymore. Kids weren't seeming to get them the way that they had a couple years ago. And I had only been out of the regular classroom for like 2 or 3 years. So that was really eye-opening for me. And then the second year is when I really started building, the curriculum around the kids. And that was, highly influenced by you and our conversations. And I learned a lot from that. Was it perfect? No, it wasn't. Like there were things that worked really great and things that I learned. So going into this next school year, Hillcrest, so the school that I'm at, we've developed an experiential learning program, which is super exciting. And I'll be teaching in there with a population of, term essential kids, right? So this underserved population in our building who predominantly are disengaged, stop attending around grade 11, credit accumulation is a challenge. And I'll be working with them to basically personalize the curriculum around them. And for the first 30 to 40 days, not even, we'll be building, it's based on experiences that we have planned for them, and to see what really, catches their interest. You see that spark, in their eyes, and we'll be picking courses based on that.
Super, super cool. I think maybe we could do a whole other episode and dive deeper into that program and maybe chronicle. Who knows what school's going to look like, but
right.
It'd be kind of cool to kind of see at the beginning what it looks like. And as you make your way through, kind of get some updates. So maybe we can do that a little later on.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. And I'm going to start blogging. I keep saying that, and it makes me nervous because I'm like, oh goodness, but I think I just need to start doing it and get it out there, because the more I think about it, like, you know, and I have that, you know, letting go of that perfectionism is really hard. And the best way to do that is just to jump into it and stop thinking about it, really.
Yeah. And that's what, like, I've said this when I had Cam on my very first episode. I'd been wanting to blog for years and capture what we were doing. And I have a writing phobia because I was told as a grade 12 student that I had the reading level of a grade 8 and blah, 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 whatever. And so I was like, I can't put this out in the world. I'm going to have everyone critiquing me and whatever. But then I had this like epiphany, and I was like, I'm asking my students to take risks and challenge themselves. And I'm like, if I'm not modeling this, then I'm a total hypocrite. So that's when I was talking to somebody about blogging, and I was like, I don't know what site to use. It needs to look perfect. And he's like, just start writing and all that stuff will come. You can fiddle with it as you go. And so you just, yes, that's.
Which is my questions to you about blogging. I've already.
Yeah. So just do it.
Yeah, I mean, part of the program that I'll be co-learning. And so I've told myself, like, my deadline is September. So like, I want to start doing blogging. I think a part of me is afraid to put myself, for me, a lot of things are personal, right? Like I personalize a lot of stuff. And for me, teaching is very personal and creative. And yeah, I guess I care and I don't care, what people think, but it's,
we all care.
Once it's out there, it's out there.
Yep. All right. So you mentioned already that you have an LD. So I ask everybody, can you tell me about your experience in the system? So tell us what life was like for you as you went through school.
Yeah. So I think I alluded to it at the beginning when I said we moved here when I was like 8 from BC. And up until that point, like I don't remember my education so much. Like I remember some, experiences. I think I do remember very, very vividly, and this has always stuck with me, from grade 1. And I think, the messages that we get, and they're from really well-intentioned, people. I think this teacher was, I remember her as a very caring individual. But I got this message really early on that I was the slow kid. And that really shaped a lot of who I later became and some of my anxieties. But, in grade 1, I'm dyscalculic. So math has never been my friend. I just didn't really know that until later on. I knew that I was below grade level in math, and I struggled, especially when I got to high school. But in grade 1, I remember doing math out of the booklets, and once you finished your math, you got to go and have free time. And there was all these cool toys, and for kids at that age, everything's about playing. And once I was finished, so I usually the last kid working on the workbook, and like working super hard, right? So like really like thinking that and I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to work faster this time. I'm just going to be faster. Not knowing that I just couldn't. And we would I would, close up my book and race over, and free time was done. And that happened probably all year. Like that makes me a little teary, because I think that those early experiences really framed how I thought about myself as a learner. So yeah, I mean, I think I had free time once, and it lasted for like 2 minutes, and then it was done. So I quickly started to realize, like, I think, like, why do I never get this, right? Like, what's different about me that I never get to do this? And it also was telling for me throughout the rest of my, educational career about how much extra time I had to spend on things when my peers were hanging out. Like I can remember doing math homework, in high school, and those were back in the days where you had like 40 questions a night. And I would go back the next day and I'd have 38 of the 40 wrong. And then I'd have to do all those ones and then do the next 40. And I was perpetually behind when it came to math. And I remember looking outside my window and my friends are playing in the street. And if I wanted to succeed in any way, I just had to work harder. And I think that's where some of, perfectionist kind of mentality came. I think it's not unique that a lot of LD kids and the kids that I work with in ASD have this idea of perfectionism. And people don't always realize that certain behaviors are perfectionism, right? Like this, I work with a lot of kids who don't want to try to do something because they want it a certain way. And they can't necessarily get it that way within the time frame that they need to complete something. So I think, going on, I think as I was diagnosed with my LD in grade 5, and I had this amazing, amazing educator who I still connect with today. And I think she was a really, it goes back to like people are the change in our system, right? She really changed things for me. Because I remember before that being in like remedial reading, because it's like people who know me know I read really slow. So it's not that I'm not a reader. I just read slow. So I'm not reading books for enjoyment, right? And I just started like a year ago reading books on like audiobooks. And the interesting thing about that is that in my own head, I kept, repeating this. It kept coming out like, well, that's cheating.
Oh.
Right. But yet I would teach kids like, so somehow in me, I kept thinking like, that's not reading if you're not reading the book. But it was so painful for me to read throughout the school year because I'm working and I'm reading all day. Right. So picking up a book that's like 200 pages or 300 pages is like a daunting thing for me. But yeah, I started reading audiobooks and I've read more books in a year than I have like in 3 years. So it's really just letting go of those internal messages. And I think a lot of those come from our experiences, as I said, with really well-intentioned people. If I go back to that grade 5 year, that teacher really made me feel good about who I was as a person. And it was less about my inabilities and more about just like who I was, and she had a really good connection and relationship with my family. And I think that helped because the following year, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. And that was a whole roller coaster of 3 years. But that was a pivotal, she set me up for what I, going into grade 7 and 8, which were challenging years for me because my dad died when I was in grade 8. But on top of that, the Spec Ed teacher I had in grade 7 and 8 was not a good match for me. And I had a lot of negative experiences. I was stuck in the same grade 6 remedial math book for 2 years. Like I never moved. And that was the start of me feeling like I can't do math. Like I thought I could do math before. I was just different. And then it was like, no, I can't do math because I'm not getting anywhere. And then that didn't help when I went to grade 9 and grade 10, where I just was perpetually behind. So I ended up hating math. But as I've gotten older, I realized like, I stopped being able to understand math at fractions. So that's about grade 6, right? So I later in my adult years learned fractions. So I am capable of learning math. It's just
differently.
Very differently. And that's okay. but that isn't the experience I had with it in school.
Right.
And then I became more and more of a perfectionist as I went through high school. And I was a good student, but I sacrificed a lot. Like I was up late throughout the night, like 2, 3 in the morning, trying to read. And I read well, my comprehension's great, but it would just take me forever. And I was determined to, I guess, I don't know if I was determined to prove to myself or prove to others. But often I think people, educators might think I was lazy because I wasn't getting something, or wasn't doing it, a certain way at first, until I had to prove to them that I was smart. Like I think I spent a lot of time trying to prove that I was smart enough.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. No, that's what this is all about.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think you've made reference to the fact that you had this amazing teacher in grade 5.
Yeah.
My next question is, and this seems to be it's reoccurring, what is good about our education system? And that one comes up a lot. It's like you said, it's the people.
It is.
Yeah. What do you think is good about our education system now?
So I think what I in my notes, I wrote people because, things, policies, curriculum change, but people are what drive, things. And if I look at the experiences I had in school, there were people who I felt cared for me, and that kept me coming back. People who, just like might seem like a small thing, but I remember like in OAC, grade 13 biology, I was struggling because it was the first time I had to take notes, and that's like a train wreck for me, because someone is like at point B or point C and I'm still processing point A, and my notes were a mess. Like no one in university ever wanted my notes. Like I learned to take notes my way with arrows and stuff everywhere, but it was really a challenge for me. And at the time we had lab techs, I guess in high school, like science lab techs, and she was in the room one day and noticed I was really struggling, and she had offered to my teacher to help tutor me on my prep spares. And she really got me through that year in biology. And I think too, it was her undying patience. Like just, I don't know, like people had shown me patience before, but she just never, like, she said something really amazing to me. She said, and I know when you've got a concept, because all of a sudden I see this, your eyes light up. And I've seen that over and over again with students that I've taught, right? So that like light up moment. And so I'm capable of getting those concepts. People have to invest a lot of time in me, which sucks because sometimes people don't want to do that, right? But yeah, I mean, where I've had really good experiences where people were just, willing to invest, and so people make everything, right? Connections with kids is everything. And so I put students and educators, because and then I wrote down possibilities, and that's being that, almost anything right now in education is possible. We have curriculum to kind of go back to, but there are a lot of possibilities in education right now, and there's a lot of change happening, and a lot of difference in thinking. And I think too, as we see students as more central in their learning, because the colonial kind of education system that that traditional education system that we're still part of, sees students as empty slates, right? And they're really they're really not. And I think this is really important for me, is that when I think back to my dad and all the skills that he had, and all the, like the really great skills that he had, and he was a locksmith, and he learned to become a locksmith because my mom dictated all his books. At the time you weren't supposed to do that, but he was really I never looked at him and didn't think he was smart. Do you know what I mean? But yet he could not read or write, so he wasn't an empty slate, and neither are the kids that I work with. And I think teaching in the ASD program, so, sometimes teachers might come to me and say, like, this kid isn't trying, or I don't know what to do with this kid. And when I talk to the students, I think, it goes back to people, right? And connections and relationships. When I talk to the students and just say, like, okay, tell me what's going on, sometimes we really miss the boat, right? Like, we don't really know what's going on with students unless we ask them. Sometimes it's not that they aren't trying, it's just that there's some major barrier there for them. And they really have been the best. Students are the best teachers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you,
that's awesome.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. So, obviously you've had your experience. We have some interesting things that are happening in education.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that our current system is failing youth at all?
So I went back to me, I was thinking of, how we often hear, youth are not prepared for the future. So this is what resonated with me when I was thinking about that. So we hear that all the time, like, kids aren't prepared for post-secondary, or kids aren't prepared for the world of work. And this sort of drives me crazy, like that statement, because you hear it all the time, because it focuses blame on the student, really. And they're only one part of this. So, and it focuses the blame on the learner, like all the deficits of the learner, right? And there's something inherently wrong with that learner. And I think that resonates with me because, it's more about learning environments, re-envisioning. What I've noticed is that our classrooms are made for desks and rows, and there's blocks, they're squares. One of the things that I did a couple of years ago was take out my teacher desk, and put myself right in the room with the kids, working with them. And I think when I go back to people, it's people who are re-envisioning the learning space. I think it's that we are in a place and time where we need to look at students, and the students in our classes every semester as the new slate. Because doing the same things we've always done, that's not working, right? I mean, it might be comfortable, but it's not working. It doesn't work for all kids. And that's not to say that, all of us reach every kid all the time, but I've really, as working with ASD kids, I've really started to realize how much the learning environment really impacts, all the sensory things. And it's not just kids on the spectrum who have sensory issues. Lots of kids with, and I have a processing LD, like a lot of kids are overstimulated in some classrooms, right? Light, noise. I never, when I got into like grade 11, 12 OAC, I didn't do a lot of work in the classroom. That's because primarily the work was reading. I couldn't read in the room because it was too loud, too noisy. I might spend the whole period on one paragraph. So, but now we have all these possibilities of doing other things with kids. It's not just about, reading and doing worksheets, and it's about, all those skills that we can tap into that we often the curriculum doesn't see. It's educators who can re-envision that, right? I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, but so question. along that line, so if we are to move forward,
Mm-hmm.
and we are to make these changes, like you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, like doing the same thing over and over is not or it's not really working anymore. How do
Yeah.
we, like, what does society, because society kind of sees school as this, like what
Yeah.
you just described in the beginning, right? Like it's
Mhm.
four walls, it's sitting in rows, it's whatever. What is society, like the parents, the students,
Yeah.
some teachers, what do they need to unlearn about our current system in order to move forward?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, because often, parents sometimes, and not intentionally, but pressures on students and teachers in order to, because they see school as how they did it, right? But education is so much different than it was, when we were in high school, and the needs. I think when I was thinking about this, in teachers college, we learned how to, read the curriculum and like make these great lessons. And I was thinking, like, what we really need to be teaching young educators is the ability to think beyond the policy and curriculum, because you can still meet those things and those parameters, but in unique ways, right? And I think, and every time I've done that, it looks so different for every kid, which is why the personalization works. And it kind of shifts the focus from, the traditional type of marking, pen and paper, to observation. But I think, what was I going to say? So going, like, what we were taught in teachers college, in that traditional model of like teach to the curriculum, going away from that causes anxiety for teachers. And I know it did for me, like, because it's like that, you're not measuring up, you're not meeting, but it took a long time for me to figure out how to meet the curriculum needs, but start in a different place.
Yeah.
Because it's hard sometimes, when you're first trying to figure that out.
Oh, I know.
So yeah, exactly. And I think too, I would get to points where I was really frustrated with things and how I was going to be able to do this. And I would always think back to, like, looking to you as an example, and how you were doing it, and asking you questions, and trying to figure out, because really sometimes you just can't, there's like a block, you know what I mean? You keep going back to the same way that you were taught, or that how to do it. And it's uncomfortable, right? I think we have to learn to lean into our discomfort. And I think the last couple of years, I really, when I went back into the history room after teaching ASD, I started to just lean into that discomfort, and I was more excited about what I was doing
Yeah, because it's
when I
new,
did that.
and you can see the kids are excited too.
Yeah, I think that was
They're
it.
scared.
Yeah. And but I think too, like, the relationships that you build with them are quite fundamentally different, because you're doing it together. I think when I went back into the room, and I had never experienced this before, like, it looked like kids were bored or weren't getting what I was doing, and I had never experienced it before. So, like, this, like, a wall of panic hit me, like, oh God, like, and for a while I was like, what am I going to do? Like, I contemplating, like, am I in the right place? Like, should I be doing this? And then I leaned in, and both the kids and I were happier, and I was busy working with them. Like, I didn't just watch them work
Yeah.
anymore. I wasn't watching them doing worksheets. I was there. We were figuring things out. We were, I was, helping them, the flow from one part of their learning to the next. And really what kids often say is that they don't get a lot of face time with teachers, right? Because, traditionally we would be up there teaching, but in this model, where the self-directed model, you're actually spending time
Yeah.
with the kid. They're getting to ask you the questions they always want, and that's learning.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much. And I always say there's, like, on my end, there's so much that I learn from my students.
Mm-hmm.
Just as you go through that, because their interests are very different than my interests. I learned a lot about shark finning this year. Never thought I would learn about shark finning. I'm currently
I have
learning.
no idea what that is.
Yeah, I'm currently learning a ton about Minecraft.
Oh, yes.
And so, yeah, so it's crazy. Okay, so I know this is a tough one, but if you could change one thing in education, what would it be?
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think it would be um, the idea that we have to, like, when we think about curriculum, it's the idea that there is one way of doing things or that we have to be perfect. Because as educators, you know, a lot of us are type A people. We like things to be good, right? But yeah, I think it would be for, and I don't know, I don't really have the answers of how that happens. I think it helps when you have admin who are really behind you and support you try new things. I think if the one thing I could, you know, would change is that people felt more free to try new things and felt that they were supported in doing that. Because often that's, I think, what holds people, the fear of like getting it wrong holds people back.
Yeah. And what do you say to that now that you've done it?
I say that it's really worth it. It's scary as heck. Like I'm terrified of this coming year, but I'm also excited because I know I'm gonna screw things up at times, right? But I use my students to inform me on my next steps because they always will, right? And I think working with ASD kids too, like the great thing about the relationships you build with them is that they'll tell you when you're like missed the boat, right? Or they'll tell you like what they think about things. But I think using students to inform our teaching practices and our learning is really important. And ASD kids have taught me that the fact that, you know, we often don't know what kids are thinking and feeling. We assume when we think we know their best interest, but unless you have these one-on-one conversations and teaching them and learning with them, you're never gonna know, right? And I'd say if you're trying to take one step to go further, try connecting one-on-one with your kid, you know, your students more, because what you learn from them is far greater than anything. And it's empowering for them, and it's because they feel listened to, and it's empowering for you because you're excited about what you're doing.
Awesome. Now I know this isn't fair because I'm going to ask you a question that wasn't on the list. Okay. But I've been asking everybody this. It came from the kids in the podcast that we do.
Okay.
And, we spend a lot of time, and I know you do this with your students as well. And you alluded to the fact that you had a grade 5 teacher that did this for you. It's really important for us to recognize what we're good at and what our strengths are. So we ask everybody at the end of each podcast, what is your superpower?
Right. And I did see that on that was on the beginning. The superpower. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so weird because that question brings a lot of anxiety, because I think traditionally, not until probably the last couple of years did I really think that I had a uniqueness, like that I had skills. Like I think growing up in the system, I just assumed that I had deficits because of my LD, and that's who I was. But I think, you know, if you were to ask me maybe a year ago, I would have definitely said empathy, like connecting to people. That's my superpower. That's everything about my job. That's how I do what I do with my, you know, my ASD families and my students. But I've started to realize, you know, in the last 2 years that my thinking is really unique. I think that's my superpower, is that when I've allowed myself to think creatively, because I think I was told in school that I wasn't creative because I wasn't an artist.
Right.
I can't draw spatially. That's awful. Um, but I am creative, and teaching is a creative. I've come to understand teaching is a creative outlet for me because I absolutely love it. Like all my creative juices are flying. So that's, that's a superpower for me. I think my non-traditional smarts. I think, when I look back to my dad, he had a lot of smarts that just were not, superpowers. I think, like, me and how I like to talk, when I get going, but that's like a superpower for me, that ability to tap into my world by communication. And I probably wouldn't have said that a couple of years ago.
Awesome. And your students are lucky to have that, right? Like to have you as a teacher and to have the ability to have someone as creative and courageous to take these next steps in trying to make changes. Awesome. All right. Well, I know you haven't started writing your blog yet.
No.
You can't put that out. But once you get it started, I know you're on Twitter. If people want to follow along with what you're doing, where can they find you?
So I have my own Twitter handle, but I think, so I've created a Connect. So our program at Hillcrest is called Connects for now until we get student voice, and that might change, but it's CNX. So you can follow what we're doing in the coming school year on Twitter or Instagram under Hillcrest Connects, CNX. And then you can find me on Twitter at, I think it's Marilyn McMillan 2 or Miss McMillan 2. I had 2 at one time, so, but I'm there. And so, yeah, but Hillcrest Connects is where you can follow and I'm going to hopefully be diligent on, posting what we're doing in our learning.
I'm going to have to teach you how to use Hootsuite. It's amazing.
What is it?
Hootsuite. It's amazing. It posts
I have no,
stuff
yes,
for
I'm
you.
excited.
Yes.
Ooh,
yes.
I like that.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Marilyn. It was awesome to hear all about you. It's even though we've known each other for 12 years, there's a lot I learned about you today that I didn't know, and I really appreciate you sharing your experiences. And I know there are other people out there. There are kids today. There are adults who probably were in your shoes as well, and we really appreciate you opening up for us.
Thanks for having me.